Thank you. Bonjour, Paris. Bonjour. So, data, consumer data. We've heard lots about how much we've been gathering, all of this consumer data. But we really have to protect it. That's the key thing. That's my key message here. Because, you know, consumers are our lifeblood, to be honest with you. Firstly, a quick disclaimer, none of this is any of the opinions of my employer. It's all my own work, so you can burst into rapturous applause at the end, directed entirely at me. So, I think Satya Nadella said it, you know, very, very succinctly when he talked about trust. Consumers, people, you, everybody in this room will only use technology if they trust it. The moment they get burnt with it is the moment they start telling their friends and then start telling the rest of the world, actually, through social media, not to trust something. This is why many sites like Amazon, for instance, you know, will not even ask for additional payment confirmation, the CVV, for instance, because they want to make everything as smooth as possible, and that's a risk they chose to take. They don't want any kind of hiccups or any kind of bad experience or too many click-throughs in their entire process. A report from 2016 by the Verizon DBIR actually tells it fairly clearly. And many of you who might be vaguely interested in information security will not be surprised by this, but some of you will, that it takes many companies over 200 days to know that they've either got a malware infection or even that they've actually had a breach and been attacked. In some cases, and this was quite incredible for me, 2,982 days was the longest present, so that's about 8 years, I think. So they must have been running Windows 98 or something like that for a very long time. And the most incredible one, that 69% of them were discovered by someone else, not the company themselves. So that's pretty, that's a great place to start with that trust thing, right? And Mandiant, again, 2016, they said that in 60% of cases that they analysed, attackers were able to get in minutes. Minutes! That's pretty bad, So if we were to, if this was put on the front page of BBC or CNN or Fake News Fox, then trust would be gone for all of our consumers. Nobody would trust us, and these are average. This is not specific at any kind of industry. This is, average across a range of industries. So is it because of these guys? Is it because we've got stupid users, or even our consumers are stupid? Is it because they're doing dumb stuff? They're the ones that are having... Yeah, you're supposed to be looking at me. They're the ones that are having the malware installed on their laptops. They're the ones that are actually, doing dumb things with their credit cards and then blaming, you for it. Or is it this guy, Hacker Man? Normally, a teenager in the basement of his parents' house who hasn't seen daylight for a few weeks. But actually, are they getting more and more sophisticated? We can always blame the Russians if nothing else, right? So that complicates users. So we've got this sort of, how do we actually start protecting ourselves against these kinds of issues? So let's talk about embedding security. Now the fact is that when I talk about users here, I talk about consumers in the same breath as well. So bear with me on that. But the reality is that we need to talk about actually making sure that security itself is embedded not only within our organisations to protect our data, but also our consumers as well. And we can ensure, therefore, that we're not sat in the middle of these two. That we're the smart ones, and actually our users and consumers are in between, are either side of us. Because I think this image sums it up. This image is a padlock gate, which requires only one padlock to be removed for the gate to be opened. So it allows multiple users to use that gate. It's fairly clever, right? Fairly clever. But it relies on the fact that the last person to use it will lock the gate. That's exactly the same with our consumers. It relies on everybody ensuring they're locked down, something we find very, very challenging to do. And that's why we end up with this attitude that, humans are the weakest link in our security. Well, actually, I disagree with that. You know, my opinion on this is that they're not the weak link, they're the only link. They're the ones that we should be communicating with. They're the ones that we absolutely have to be hammering this stuff home to. I'm afraid I don't know who to attribute this quote to. I did see it fairly recently, and I'll find out who, and if somebody else knows, then please do let me know. So how do we communicate in a way that makes sense to people, in a way that actually we can work with them? There's two ways. Language, funny enough, but it's actually not just language, not just words, it's the way we use the words and the words we choose. And choice architecture, which will make much more sense once we get to it. Let's look at language first, and I think I love this story of General Patton before he leads his armies into battle, and certain death, and lots and lots of horrible unpleasantries. His pep rallies, his speeches were littered with profanities, absolutely littered with profanities, and telling everybody that they were going to die, to the point where the journalists of the day felt that they couldn't actually reprint or print out a copy of his speech in the newspapers. It was just, just too awful. And when asked about this, Patton's point of view was, an army that can't swear is an army that can't fight its way out of a paper bag. He was talking to the army in the language that they understood, in the rough and the ready army, and the truth and the native facts. And that's something we have to do with our consumers. We have to recognise who our consumers are, recognise what kind of niche they operate in, and talk to them in their language about why certain things are important, why we ask them to do two-factor or multi-factor authentication, if at all, why we ask them for passwords of 8 or more digits, although that's a contentious point at the moment anyway. But why we ask them to do things, not only protect themselves, but to protect the whole community, their entire ecosystem. The second one is choice architecture, and it's another lovely story. It was in a high school in the USA, and they had a problem with teenage girls putting on lipstick and kissing the mirrors in the bathroom. And I don't know if any of you have heard this one. But of course, lipstick is very difficult to get off mirrors, especially if they're covered in them. And the principal put out a message, do not kiss the mirrors, blah, blah, blah. And of course, more girls kiss the mirrors. So she worked on something else. She brought in, a large group of girls, and they did this, for everybody. And the janitor was there as well. And she said, look, I've asked you not to put lipstick on the mirrors. And the reason is it's so difficult to clean off. It doesn't bother me as such, but it's just so difficult to clean off. Joe, could you show us how hard it is to clean this lipstick off? So he picks up the mop, washes it in the toilet pan, and rubs it up and down. Does that second time. He says, I have to do this 3 or 4 times before it all comes off. So you can kind of imagine that there was a lot less lipstick on those mirrors shortly afterwards. Now, and again, it's a similar thing. You're talking to our users, our people, in a way that makes the right choice correct. So, for instance, and we could be talking about tying internal security breaches to bonus or performance, for instance, actually highlighting the impacts that particular breaches might have on the business, or even on the prices that you can offer to your, to your consumers. So it's about actually telling people that their actions matter and connect all the way through, to how it will impact them directly. And I think, that Maya Angelou's, the American, poet, basically said, they'll forget what you say, forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you make them feel. You really have to tie in this whole sort of storytelling matrix together in order to get your point across to people. Don't just give them the do's and don'ts. You give them the whys, the wherefores, the antagonist, the protagonist, the love story, the smoking gun, etc., etc. Whatever works for you. But using that storytelling and weaving that into the way you communicate will ensure that people will know why it's important to protect the data Not just because GDPR says so, but actually because it's important. And it's important to the trust that the users and the consumers have in you as a brand, or a service. So, as you probably gathered from those earlier slides, it's not a case of if we get hacked. It's more a case of we're already hacked. And that's true in many, many cases for everybody here. I doubt there will be many companies in this room that haven't had a breach, or are in the midst of having a breach, or even have been breached and don't know it. Very, very few organisations will even know, will actually have not been breached at all. So what do you do about it? Now I'm going to ask a question. You don't have to stand up and fold your arms and put your leg around your elbow or something like that. But I'm going to ask a question, which is, how many of you know that you have a formal and practiced cyber incident response plan? Okay, and that was some half-hearted hands up as well, right? I think I do, I'm pretty sure I do. I'm going to say yes. There's not many of you, maybe 10%. The average is around about sort of 20-25%, on the whole, as to having some kind of response. And that's kind of obvious in a sense, because Gartner said last year that 80% of security budgets go into protect. They go into firewalls, basically. Firewalls and blinky boxes and, paying expensive vendors to supply expensive services that supply maybe expensive results that may not be quite so good as you want. So only 10%, and this is rounded figures, 10% goes into detect. So actually when you are breached, when you have been hacked, 10% of their budget is actually looking into being able to see that they've been hacked. And 10% goes into respond. I think that actually that 10% budget makes up for the tea and biscuits for the meeting where they said, shall we actually write a plan? Yeah, let's write a plan. And then don't quite get around to it. So this is pretty shocking, really. And protect is actually 15 years out of date. Protect was when we used to build a fortress. Protect was when we had a defined perimeter of firewalls and blocks, and you had to come into the office in order to connect to the network, etc. Hands up if you work like that. Hands up if you can only connect to your network from inside your office and nowhere else. One. There's always one, isn't there? Although he was half-hearted again. Next time we ask a question, let's power those arms up. So it's incredibly rare. Our perimeter has become entirely perforated with holes to allow us to work. Now, kind of the good news is Gartner says that by 2020, they've looked in their crystal ball and taken a look, is it's going to even out a lot more. So it's going to be roughly 60% will be spent in detect and respond. Now let's focus on respond, because respond is actually the most important part, because it actually makes the most sense, Respond is something you really need to do because it's definitely going to happen. Protect and detect, well, brilliant, yeah, they're the first layers in the onion, but let's actually make sure that we can get a plan together. So, again, I've just covered this. So are you going to be one of these companies that is going to put in place a plan for dealing with incidents when the time comes? Because again, let's go back to Satya Nadella. Our consumers need to trust us. So let's get a plan together. I think this was a very carefully planned environment here. What could possibly go wrong? But let's get a plan together, because the plan is what is most important here. And the very first thing is create one team. It doesn't matter how big your organisation is, how many thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people you have one team. There may be lots and lots of subsequent teams underneath, but they all report into one team. Otherwise you end up looking like this guy at the end here, because nobody actually knows. It's everybody's responsibility, therefore it's nobody's responsibility to deal with things. And as we're going to see, the collaboration and the coordination is absolutely vital when we're creating this plan. You also need to practice the plan. Now, there's different ways of doing this. There's obviously, just running through the documentation and making a few phone calls. You can do a tabletop exercise. You can actually close down the business for a couple of hours while you do something, or even get all the C-level execs into a room, without telling them, and tell them they've got to work out, how to get out of the way of an incident. That's great. Or you can also ensure that all those little incidents that you have use the same process. And then you know that that process is being worked and worked. It's being stress tested. So it may not be a reportable incident. It may not be something that's big enough to make the headlines, but it's still an instance of some description. It allows you to test it and work it and work it. We also need to collaborate. We also need to collaborate and communicate. I obviously forgot the words on this slide. But the collaboration and communication is incredibly important, and this is the key thing here. When we talk to our clients and our consumers about when we've had a breach, every single company that's made the headlines has made the headlines because they completely screwed up the communication and the transparency part. There was a major car driving service recently that hit the news. There was TalkTalk in the UK, for instance. There's Adobe who've done this. There's so many companies out there that actually start to not even tell the truth. There've been some blatant incidents of companies lying to their consumers about what's happened to their data and where their data has gone. That's the absolute no-no. Because there's a guy out there called Troy Hunt. I don't know if anybody has heard of Troy Hunt. Australian, and he has a site called Have I Been Pwned, etc. Check him up, troyhunt.com. He knows when you've been breached. And he tracks your responses. And in fact, he commends these four here. Now, I said I've not heard of India or Ethereum in the news. I read about them yesterday, funny enough. Now, when I talk about have you heard of their breach, I'm talking about in the major news outlets, etc. But all four of these, and a whole host of others, have suffered breaches, but have been commended on the way that they respond to their customers, the way that they manage their customers' lost data and how they deal with them. And that is the list of people that you want to be a part of. So your consumers actually end up with more trust with you than before the breach. And believe me, it does happen. A company called Duosec was breached a number of years ago. Their response was incredible, and their sales, etc., went through the roof because people saw them as people they could trust. So, nearly done. Just remember, there's three things. You've got to take away three things. We're going to try and keep them as simple as possible. So embed that security through your organisation. Talk to people in the languages that they understand. Give them the choice that is the right choice for them to take. Don't think it's a case of if, but when. You have been hacked. I would put good money on it. And then, when it does happen, don't forget to apologise. That's, again, a key aspect of this communication to your customers and generating trust, is apologise, but then be helpful, honest, specific. Tell them what to do, why they need to do it, what are the impacts of it, how you're going to help them moving forward. And that doesn't always just mean shoving them $80 worth of consumer credit checking or anything like that. Actually, this is an opportunity to really, really shine. And that will be my closing point here, is embrace the darkness. It won't be as bad as you think it is when it actually happens. Thank you very much. I'm here all day and here if you want to speak on.